All right, so the search, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because my main piece of advice for this is keep it extensive. There is a general rule of thumb that we like to keep our searches no more than 12 months out of date, but I know that that depends on the evidence base. So really the main advice I have to give in this area is seek advice from an experienced information specialist. They are the experts, they know what they're doing. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask for advice and listen to what they have to say. Then we move on to selection and extraction of data. So this is, again, usually relatively straightforward. All you have to do is follow the guidance in the handbook. So the guidance recommends that, it's 2 authors working independently. But you also need to think at this stage that what happens if those 2 authors disagree. This is very likely, this does happen. So you need to make sure you have a clear plan in mind for, okay, if this does happen, we will discuss it with the full review team until a decision is resolved. And this is also another reason why, in terms of the author team, minimum of 3 people, like any less than 3, then you are just going to get into trouble. And this is exactly why. And then, as we covered already, it is important to include studies regardless of whether you can get any outcome data that is reported in a usable way or not. And the best thing you can really do before even beginning your protocol is to pilot your data extraction form. So make your data extraction form, get a study that you know is going to be included, and pilot it. See how it works, see if it is gathering the information you need, see if it's easy to use, easy for others to use. And then that means when you come to write your protocol, you can say, we have piloted this data extraction form, and gives that extra level of confidence in it. Now, the next section is risk of bias. And I know we do now have a new risk of bias 2 tool. Now, this new risk of bias 2 tool is, it's fantastic. There have been experts working on this tool for years, and they have come up with something that's much better than the risk of bias 1 tool. But it also is a bit tricky, and it's taking some people a while to sort of get their heads around and really know how to use properly. So for that reason, at this stage, we're not making it mandatory that you use risk of bias 2 in your review. It's still perfectly acceptable to plan to use risk of bias version 1. There are just still a few issues I want to flag if you are using risk of bias version 1. First of all, make sure you're citing the correct version of the tool. People have a tendency to say, we'll use risk of bias version 1, but then they cite the current version of the handbook, which is Higgins 2022, which is not right, because that version of the handbook talks about risk of bias 2. If you're using risk of bias 1, you need to cite the older version of the handbook, Higgins 2011. And this is another thing that needs to be done by 2 authors working independently. And if you're using risk of bias 1, avoid adding on domains to the tool. If you think a domain is missing, chances are the information you're trying to capture is already being captured by one of the earlier domains. And also, it's important to consider whether some of the risk of bias domains might be better assessed separately for different outcomes. So, for example, blind team of outcome assessors is very often assessed twice, once for subjective outcomes and once for objective outcomes, because knowledge of whether the participant received the intervention, for example, if it's a subjective outcome, if it's quality of life and the outcome assessor knows that the person received the intervention, they might be more likely to score them up in quality of life and think, yeah, they do look happier. Whereas if it's an objective outcome like death, and the outcome assessor knows the person received the intervention, that's not going to make an impact on whether they record the person as dead or not. There's no 2 ways about it. So it's important to think about that and clarify in protocol stage if you will be doing that and for what reason. But if you are feeling adventurous and want to move on to risk of bias 2, then I fully encourage you to do that. And I'm not going to go into any detail here because it is a very detailed tool, and all of the resources you need are already available on this website, the Risk of Bias 2 website on the Cochrane Methods website, on the Cochrane Methods. We have your introduction documents, your starter pack, some webinars that you can watch. And actually these editorial checklists at the end are really useful. As an editor, I use them constantly. So I strongly encourage you to look at this page if you are considering using risk of bias 2 in your protocol. Next up, measures of treatment effect. So again, this is usually a relatively straightforward section. You just have to think about the outcomes that you're measuring and make sure that you've planned measures of treatment effect that matches them all. So for dichotomous data, you'll probably be using risk ratio or odds ratio. For continuous data, you'll probably be using mean difference or standardized mean difference. But if you have an outcome that's actually a time to event outcome, you need to consider this and make sure that there is a plan for how you will incorporate this time to event data, most likely with hazard ratios. Unit of analysis issues. So again, this is a section we see this very, very common error where people just, in this section, will write something simply like, the unit of analysis in this review was the individual, full stop. That's wrong. There's multiple different types of unit of analysis issues that you need to consider, and you need to make sure you have a plan for all of these types if they're relevant to your review question. So cluster randomized trials, crossover trials, and study of multiple treatment groups are very common in most of the areas, and so you need a clear plan for each of these. And some studies might even have a within body design. For example, you might receive one intervention on one eye and a different intervention on the other eye. So the person is their own control, but they're receiving two different interventions. And that's a unit of analysis issue that can be prepared for in advance and should be. Similarly, missing data. So again, people often make the mistake of just thinking missing data is just about if there's participants missing, then we'll contact the authors and ask for the data. When in fact, there's multiple different missing data issues that you have to consider. I mean, yes, there's missing participants, but there might also be missing summary data, missing standard deviations, and missing study design information. And this is especially important if you're doing your risk of bias assessment. Assessment of heterogeneity. Again, a very common issue is people will give a great description of how they're going to examine statistical heterogeneity in the review using the Q statistic and the I-squared statistic. And importantly, they will also clarify that we'll only be pulling data in an analysis if the studies are sufficiently similar. But what is often missing from this section is any consideration of clinical heterogeneity or methodological heterogeneity. So this is things like, the types of participants, interventions, the range of risk of bias in the study designs. So it's important to think about these things as well and make sure that there's a clear plan for both these issues in the protocol, and that your decision to pull data is based on this as well as the statistical heterogeneity. Assessment of reporting bias. So again, this is usually straightforward. People just use this section to state that they will assess publication bias using a funnel plot as long as there are at least 10 studies available for meta-analysis. And as many of you will know who have done a Cochrane review, a lot of the time there are not 10 studies available for a meta-analysis and you cannot do a funnel plot. But I just want to flag that, when it comes to doing your field review, this is just one way of making a judgment about risk of bias due to missing results. As well as funnel plots, there's also things you can consider, like look for qualitative signals that suggest that not all studies were identified, or compare with protocols of published reports to see if there's any non-reporting of results. So a funnel plot is the easiest way to assess and report this, but it's not the only way. I just wanted to flag that. But for the protocol, it's sufficient to just say, I'll create a funnel plot. And then the data synthesis section. So in this section, you need to make it clear that you're going to be conducting a meta-analysis, again, but only if it's appropriate, if you have at least 2 studies that are suitable and sufficiently similar to be pulled. And this section is also where you clarify if you're going to use a fixed effect or a random effect model. But one error that people do tend to make is, rather than choosing fixed or random, they say, we'll use fixed, but then we might switch to random if the I-squared shows a lot of heterogeneity. And this is not actually an appropriate way to do this. the Cochrane Handbook recommends that you don't use the I-squared measure as a way to decide whether to do fixed or random. You have to know enough about the evidence base yourself beforehand to make a judgment about whether this evidence base is likely to be heterogeneous or not. And if you know this evidence base and you know there's going to be heterogeneity, then you plan to do a random effects model right from the start. But if you know this evidence base and you know actually it's very homogeneous, then you say, nope, I am confident there's no other heterogeneity. I'm going to use a fixed model throughout. It's also important, to consider what you will do if you cannot do a meta-analysis. Maybe there won't be enough studies, or maybe the studies will just be too different to pull in one analysis. And it's good to say, yes, you will do a narrative description, but you need a proper plan, and there are proper methods for doing these narrative descriptions that you need to consider and you need to outline. So, ideally, this is what this section should look like. We will account for expected heterogeneity by using the random effects model. And if we're doing a narrative synthesis, we will do so with the recommendations of the synthesis without meta-analysis guidance, the SWIM guidance that you can find available online. Subgroup analyses. So again, there's often a few errors that are made at protocol stage here that then filter through to the full review that are much harder to correct at full review stage. So it's important to keep your list of subgroup analyses to an absolute minimum. Again, the more subgroup analyses you include, the more you increase your risk of type 1 error, where if you run enough analyses, eventually you'll find something interesting, and that's not how to do it. You want to focus on what are the important effect modifiers and just focus on them. Make sure that they're clearly defined, and also make sure that in the protocol, you're specifically saying we'll be comparing these using a formal statistical test, because a lot of people think that a subgroup analysis is just dividing studies into different subgroups and then reporting the results from within those two subgroups. That's actually not a subgroup analysis. A subgroup analysis is the formal test that RevManWeb does for you, so it's right there for you. But it's the test for subgroup differences that RevManWeb will report for you in the analysis, and that is what you need to base your result on. So when it comes to the protocol, it's good to demonstrate that you know this by including a statement like, we will compare subgroups using the formal test for subgroup differences in RevManWeb, just to really hammer home the point that you understand what a subgroup analysis is and you're going to do it right. Sensitivity analyses. Again, we don't usually see many errors in this section, other than people will sometimes confuse a sensitivity analysis and a subgroup analysis. But it's important to remember that sensitivity analyses are used to assess the robustness of the results, to test out the decisions that you made, and to see whether a different result might have come about if you had made a different decision during your review process. So for example, here we have a list of sensitivity analyses, which are looking at excluding studies based on their quality. So that's fine. That was a decision made by the review authors to pull together studies regardless of quality. To not impute data for missing participants. So that's fine. That's a decision that the review authors made to impute data. But here, excluding studies focusing on patients aged 60 and over. That's not a decision made by the review authors. That is a potential effect modifier. So that is something that should be explored with a subgroup analysis, not a sensitivity analysis. So just to outline this again, because this is something people do get confused with, subgroup analysis, you're using it to look at, sorry, the subheadings are different there. Sorry, the first column should be sensitivity analysis. Not subgroup analysis. I'll change those slides before I share them with everyone. But a sensitivity analysis is looking at the different decisions, and a subgroup analysis is looking at the heterogeneity and answering specific questions about the particular type of patient intervention or study type. I'm sorry about that. I will correct that slide before it is sent anywhere else. I'll stop there and see if anyone has any questions or comments that we need to cover.
Okay, there was a question about an outcome, I think, and we were talking about the outcomes, but that was related to a previous section. So I suggest that you move on.
Okay.
And then and then also a question about the search strategy. Perhaps this one you could answer now. Should you register the review once you have a rough first draft of a search strategy, or wait until you have decided on the final search strategy? So when to register?
I mean, I'm not sure why. I think rather than the search strategy, I think the first thing we focus on is the research question and the eligibility criteria. I don't think the search strategy should sort of determine when you register the review. I think it should be more about the research question and, you know, the actual focus of the review. But I would double check that with an information specialist, because it might be something more specific there that I'm not understanding.
Okay, so let's move on then.
Okay. And then finally, the last section in a protocol is the summary of findings table section. So again, this is relatively new. It's only in the past few years that conducting a grade assessment to, you know, assessing the certainty of the evidence and presenting that grade assessment in a summary findings table has become more mandatory. So as a result, we now have a separate section in the protocol for the plan for summary findings tables. And it's very important that you get all of the relevant information in this section and you make decisions at this stage and don't wait until you see the data and then make your decisions. So people seem to understand that in this section you outline which outcomes you're going to prioritize for presentation in the table. But a lot of people don't realize that you're also meant to pre-specify which comparisons you're going to present as tables. If you're doing a review where it's just one comparison, you know, it's just one intervention versus placebo, that's fine. It probably will just be one summary findings table. But if it's a review that's going to include lots of different comparisons, so, you know, intervention versus placebo, intervention versus different type of intervention, you know, you need to think about all those different types of comparisons, prioritize them, and make sure the most important comparisons are being presented as tables. And then, yes, you need to think about the outcomes. So again, we're still recommending no more than 7 outcomes in a summary of findings table. And these should be chosen now at protocol stage based on what is most clinically important for decision makers. The decision of which outcomes to present, it should be consistent with the review objectives in the PICO. And it should also be balanced. It should also include both outcomes of benefit and outcomes of harm. And another issue that people don't quite realize is that each outcome should only be presented once in the table. It usually comes that when you do the review, you'll find that outcomes are measured in multiple different ways or at multiple different time points. And people will then just present all these multiple measures and multiple time points in the same table. And we end up with these lengthy tables of like 10, 20 rows. So again, the summary of findings table is not meant to capture everything. It's meant to highlight the most important information. So you need to think at protocol stage and decide now, what is the most important type of measurement of this outcome that a decision maker needs to see? And what is the most important time point that the decision maker needs to know about? And focus the summary findings table on that. And the reason you have to make that decision now is because then you are more likely to be unbiased and make that decision based on what is important for decision makers. Whereas if you wait until you have all your data and you're putting together your table, the temptation is to present outcomes that have lots of information or have really high certainty evidence. And that, again, it's an unbiased decision and it's not what the decision maker needs to see. So for example, here we have this method section, which shows, you know, it's good in the sense that it has a short number of outcomes. They're balanced, there's benefit and harm outcomes here. But there's no mention here of which comparisons are going to be presented as tables. As well as that, there's no hierarchy for what are we going to do if these outcomes are reported in multiple different ways, which measure and time point we will use. And you also need to be very careful about describing grade in the protocol. So people often cut and paste from other protocols because there's only so many ways you can describe the grade software, to be fair. The problem is you need to make sure that what you are typing is relevant to your review. So for example, people have this tendency to say, we'll justify decisions to downgrade or upgrade the quality of studies using footnotes. And if this is a review of randomized controlled trials, it's not relevant to talk about upgrading evidence. You only really upgrade evidence if it's a review of non-randomized studies. So you just need to be very careful that you are only reporting the relevant information in this section. So really, this is what this section should look like. You know, we have the outcomes, but we also have a plan for how to prioritize different time points and a plan for how to prioritize different measures. And we also have specifically said of all of the comparisons in this review, these are the 3 most important comparisons. So these are the 3 tables that we're going to present. And also removing the incorrect plan to upgrade evidence from RCTs. And I would just want to flag again that when it comes to doing your grade assessment, there is a grade handbook. Chapter 5 in the grade handbook specifically outlines in a great amount of detail exactly what you're meant to do and how to do it. So I strongly encourage you, even if you think you know what you're doing, it's still worth going back and looking at that chapter again, just to check you really are up to date on all the current guidelines and recommendations. And then finally, just to finish off, there are just a few general issues and errors I just want to flag. I mean, when you're putting together your author team, it is important to make sure that there's a good range of skills and expertise in the team. You will need a mixture of clinical expertise as well as methodological expertise. And ideally, the perspective of stakeholders as well is always invaluable. In a protocol, remember that you're writing in future tense. We will combine data rather than past tense. We excluded these reviews, we combine data. In fact, if you see a protocol that's written in past tense, that's usually a red flag because it suggests that maybe the authors have already done what they're describing and they're doing the protocol in retrospect. And that is absolutely not what you're meant to do. So just avoid that red flag, write in future tense. And I would recommend avoiding copying and pasting directly from templates where possible. There are a lot of really helpful templates that are great starting points, but just because you've cut and pasted the right text, it's not enough. You need to understand, you need to make sure you really know what you're talking about and you have made a plan that makes sense for your specific research question. And also remember to prepare for conflicts of interests. So, if you are, because you're probably going to have clinical experts in the review, there's a good chance that they will be study authors under studies that you intend to include in the review, which is fine. It's quite reasonable. It happens quite a lot, but you need to make sure that those review authors are not involved in the risk of bias assessment of their own studies or making grade judgments of evidence that includes their own studies, things like that. And the most important thing is ask for help and do it sooner rather than later. Don't wait until the review to make these decisions. You think you'll get away with it. You think it's fine. You'll figure it out once it happens. But it's so much more stressful when you're sitting with hundreds of studies in front of you and trying to make decisions then on what it is you were actually looking for in the first place or how you think this data is best pulled or best presented. So I would just say plan now and make sure you're planning for everything you possibly can.